The first wife found out on a winter night when the silence between them had grown so thick it had its own weight. They'd been married 14 months, and every month she'd waited, and every month nothing came. And the doctor in town had finally said what Caleb Howell had known since he was 19 years old, but had never said out loud to anyone. The fever he'd had as a boy, the one that nearly killed him, the one his mother prayed over for 6 days straight, had left him alive, but had taken something in the leaving. He couldn't father children. The doctor used gentler language, medical words, words meant to cushion. But Mary heard what was underneath them, and she sat in the doctor's office and didn't move for a long time. And then she went home and packed her trunk, and her father came the next morning with a wagon, and that was the end of it. She didn't yell. She didn't cry where he could see her. She just left, and the quiet she left behind was different from the quiet that had been there before. It was the quiet of a verdict. The second wife knew before she married him. He told her because he'd learned from the first time that secrets don't stay buried. They just rot under the surface until the ground caves in. Her name was Ellen, and she was 31, and she said she didn't mind, that she'd had a hard childhood and wasn't sure she wanted to put a child through the world anyway. She said this with conviction, and Caleb believed her, and they married in the spring, and for 8 months it was good. She was warm and practical, and she could make a cabin feel lived in just by being in it. But somewhere around the 9th month, something shifted. She started going quiet at the table when families with children rode past the property. She'd stand at the window and watch the neighbors' kids playing in the field, and her hand would drift to her stomach and rest there like she was holding something that wasn't there. She left on a Monday. She was kinder about it than Mary had been. She sat across from him and said, "I thought I could live without it. I can't. I'm sorry, Caleb. You deserve better than a woman who's grieving something she never had." He watched her ride away, and he thought that she was wrong. He didn't deserve better. He didn't deserve anything. He was 34 years old, and he had a ranch and a cabin and 200 head of cattle, and none of it mattered. Because the one thing the world expected a man to do, the one thing that made him a man in the eyes of every person in every town he'd ever walked through, was the one thing his body refused to give. After Ellen, he closed the door. Not the cabin door, the one inside him, the one that let people in. He was done trying, done explaining, done watching women calculate the cost of loving a man who couldn't give them what they wanted. He worked his ranch alone for 12 years. 12 years of fences and cattle and seasons turning over, and the cabin growing quieter each year until the quiet wasn't even painful anymore. It was just there, like the mountains, like the creek, part of the landscape of a life that had settled into a shape he didn't like but had stopped fighting. The town of Ridgefield knew about Caleb the way small towns know everything, thoroughly, permanently, and with just enough distortion to make the truth unrecognizable. The version that circulated was simple. Caleb Howell can't give a woman children. 2 wives tried. 2 wives left. Don't waste your time. The women in town looked at him with that particular combination of pity and avoidance that told him he'd been sorted into a category that didn't include future. The men were worse. They talked about him in the saloon with the careless cruelty that men use when they're grateful something hasn't happened to them. Good land, shame about the man on it. What's the point of a ranch with no sons to leave it to? He heard all of it. He absorbed all of it. And he kept going because the cattle needed feeding, regardless of what the town thought of the man who fed them. He was 46 years old the day the wagon came. He was mending the gate on the east pasture when he saw it on the road below, moving slow, loaded heavy, pulled by a mule that had seen better years. The left rear wheel had a wobble he could see from 200 yards, and he watched it the way you watch something you know is about to break. The wheel gave out a quarter mile from his gate. It didn't shatter. It just folded, the spokes buckling inward, and the whole wagon tilted and came to rest at an angle in the dust. He heard the voices before he reached them. Children, multiple, high and sharp and frightened. He walked down the hill and around the bend and found the wagon listing in the road with a woman on her knees in the dirt, trying to brace the axle with a length of firewood, while 4 children stood in the road behind her in a cluster, holding on to each other. The woman looked up at him. She was maybe 30, though hard living had a way of making 30 look older out here. Her face was sun-browned and sharp-jawed, and her hair was dark and pinned back messily, and her dress was patched at the elbows and the hem, and her hands were bleeding from where she'd been gripping the splintered wood. She looked at Caleb without fear, and without pleading, and without any of the softness that women in town put on when they wanted something. She looked at him the way a person looks at a situation they need to solve. "Wheel's gone," she said. "I don't suppose you've got a spare." "I've got a barn with tools. I can fix it." "How long?" "Half a day, maybe more." She looked at the children. The oldest was a girl around 12 with her mother's jaw and her arms around a boy of maybe 9. Next to them stood a younger girl, 6 or 7, with a rag doll hanging from one hand. And behind all of them, half hidden, was a boy of about 4 with his thumb in his mouth and dust on his face. "We'll wait," the woman said, "if you don't mind." "I don't mind." He unhitched the mule and walked it to the barn, and the woman gathered the children, and they followed him up the hill to the cabin. He didn't invite them inside. He didn't need to. The 4-year-old tripped on a rock and started crying, and the woman had the 6-year-old in one arm and couldn't reach him, and Caleb bent down and picked the boy up without thinking and set him on his hip, and the boy stopped crying and looked at him and put one dusty hand flat against Caleb's chest, like he was checking if something was there. By the way, if this story is already working its way into your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what country you're listening from. Every comment means the world to us. Now let's keep going. Her name was Josephine Wilder. Joe. She told him while he worked on the wheel, and she sat on an overturned bucket near the barn watching him with the same direct gaze she'd given him on the road. The children were in the yard, the oldest girl, Nettie, keeping watch over the others with the competence of a child who'd been doing a grown woman's work for too long. "My husband died 7 months ago," Joe said. She said it without ceremony, the way you state the weather. "Logging accident up in Montana. Tree came back on him wrong. By the time they pulled him out, there wasn't enough left to bury proper." She paused, but not for sympathy, for breath. "We had a place up there. Small. It wasn't ours. We were tenants on a man's timberland. And when James died, the man said we had 30 days to leave. 30 days. 4 children and 30 days. "Where are you headed?" "My sister's. She married a man in Baker City. She said we could stay until I figured something out. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been figuring ever since." Caleb worked the wheel and listened. He was good at listening. 12 years of silence had made him good at it. He listened to the way she talked about her children, not with sentimentality, but with the fierce, practical love of a woman who understood that keeping them alive was more important than keeping them comfortable. He listened to the way she didn't talk about herself, how every sentence circled back to them, their needs, their hunger, their future. He listened to the way she said her dead husband's name, James, with neither bitterness nor grief, but with the flat acceptance of a woman who had already done her mourning and moved on because 4 children don't give you the luxury of standing still. The wheel took longer than half a day. A spoke was cracked beyond mending, and Caleb had to shape a new one from oak in the barn, which meant the repair stretched into evening. Joe fed the children from the supplies in the wagon, hard biscuits and dried meat and the last of a jar of preserves, and Caleb watched from the barn door and thought about the pantry in his cabin that was stocked with enough food for a man who ate alone, and how much of it would be left if 6 people sat at his table. The answer was not enough. And then he thought about the fact that he was calculating, and he told himself to stop because they'd be gone by morning, and calculating was just another word for hoping, and hoping was something he'd given up a long time ago. But the wheel wasn't done by nightfall. He told Joe she could sleep in the cabin with the children, and he'd stay in the barn. She refused at first. She was a woman alone with 4 children and a strange man, and trust wasn't something she distributed freely. He understood. He said, "I'll leave the barn door open. You can see me from the window. And your girl looks like she hasn't slept in a real bed in weeks." Joe looked at Nettie, who was sitting on the porch step with the 4-year-old asleep in her lap, her eyes half closed, her thin shoulders carrying a weight that no 12-year-old should know the shape of. Joe looked at Caleb. She measured him the way she'd measured the road and the wheel, and every other obstacle she'd faced in the last 7 months, and then she nodded. He lay in the barn that night and listened to the sounds coming from his cabin. Footsteps, murmuring, the creak of the bed, the 4-year-old crying once, briefly, and then Joe's voice, low and steady, and then silence. His cabin had sound in it. For the first time in 12 years, his cabin held the noise of living, and it traveled across the yard and through the barn walls and into his chest where it sat like a coal that wouldn't cool. Morning came and he finished the wheel. It was solid work. It would hold. He fitted it to the axle and hitched the mule, and the wagon stood level and ready, and there was no reason for Josephine Wilder and her 4 children to stay another hour on Caleb Howell's property. No reason at all. He stood by the wagon, and she stood across from him, and the children were already climbing in, and he should have said, "Safe travels," or "Good luck," or something a man says to a stranger he'll never see again. But the 4-year-old, his name was Willie, was standing at Caleb's boot, looking up at him with both arms raised, the way small children do when they want to be picked up. And Caleb looked down at those arms, and he felt 12 years of locked doors straining on their hinges. He picked the boy up. Willie put his head on Caleb's shoulder and stuck his thumb in his mouth and closed his eyes like the matter was settled. Joe watched this. Her face did something complicated, a tightening around the jaw and a loosening around the eyes that happened at the same time, like 2 different women fighting for the same expression. "He doesn't do that," she said quietly. "Not with anyone. Not since James." Caleb held the boy and felt his small weight against his chest, and the flutter of his breathing, and the heat of his head against his neck. And something in him that had been dead for 12 years drew breath. "Your sister in Baker City," he said. "She expecting you by a certain day?" "No, she just said come when we can." "And when you get there, what's the plan?" Joe's jaw tightened. "I work, I find a room, I keep them fed. Same plan as always." "I have a different plan," Caleb said, "if you'll hear it." She looked at him, careful, guarded, ready to say no. "I've got 300 acres, he said. A cabin that's too big for one man, a pantry that's stocked, and 12 years of quiet that I'm tired of pretending is enough. I'm not offering charity. I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering a deal. You and the children stay. I'll provide the land, the roof, the work. You provide what this place has been missing, which is life." He paused. "I need to tell you something first, and I need to tell you because the last 2 women I told left, and I'd rather you leave now than later." "Tell me." "I can't father children. A fever when I was young. It's permanent. Every woman I've been with has left because of it. That's who I am. That's what you'd be getting." Joe looked at him for a long time. She looked at Willie, sleeping on his shoulder. She looked at Nettie and the boy and the younger girl sitting in the wagon watching. She looked at the cabin and the barn and the pastures and the mountains beyond. And then she looked back at Caleb and said something that no woman had ever said to him in his entire life. "I have 4 children, Caleb. 4. I know what it is to have children. I know what it costs and what it gives and what it breaks inside you and what it builds. I don't need a man who can give me more children. I need a man who'll love the ones I've got. Can you do that?" "Yes." "You sure?" "Because they're loud and they're messy, and Willie cries at night, and Nettie's too grown for her age, and Thomas gets into everything, and Bess talks to her doll like it's a real person, and none of it is easy, and none of it is quiet. I've had quiet, Caleb said. 12 years of it. I don't want it anymore. Joe looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and her jaw was tight, and she was holding herself together with the same fierce practicality she brought to everything. She nodded once. Short, definite. The way a woman nods when she's made a decision she's not going to unmake. Then we'll stay. They married the following week. The preacher came to the ranch because Caleb had no interest in standing in Ridgefield's church while the town watched and whispered about the man who can't and the woman who settled. Joe wore a clean dress and wildflowers that Bess had picked and woven into a crooked crown for her hair. Nettie stood as witness, with an expression that was half relief and half something harder. The look of a girl who wanted to believe, but had learned that believing cost something. Thomas held the rings, which were bent iron bands Caleb had shaped on his anvil. And Willie stood between Caleb's boots with both arms wrapped around his leg and didn't let go for the entire ceremony. The town talked. The town always talked. Caleb Howell married a woman with 4 children because no woman without children would have him. They said it with pity. They said it with amusement. They said it with the confidence of people who believed they understood a situation they'd never been inside of. Caleb heard the talk and did what he'd always done with talk. He let it pass through him like wind through a fence and went back to work. But now the work was different. Now the work had weight and direction and purpose. He wasn't building a life for himself anymore. He was building it for 6. Nettie took the longest to trust him. She watched him for weeks with those careful eyes, cataloging every interaction, every tone, every moment when a man might turn into something dangerous. Caleb gave her room. He never stood between her and a door. He never raised his voice. He asked her opinion about the ranch, which pasture to move the cattle to, whether the root cellar was stocked right, and he listened to her answers because they were good answers, and because being listened to was something she needed more than she needed to be told everything would be all right. The moment that changed things between them was small. Caleb had brought a book home from town, a collection of poems he'd found at the general store for 10 cents, and he'd left it on the table without saying anything. Nettie found it that evening and held it like something fragile and looked at him across the room and said, "Is this for me?" He said, "If you want it." She sat down and opened it and read in silence for an hour. And when she went to bed, she took it with her, and in the morning it was under her pillow, and she never mentioned it, and neither did he. But something between them had shifted in the way that things shift when a man pays attention to who a child actually is, instead of who he needs her to be. Thomas attached to the ranch like he'd been born on it. He was 9 and fearless, and he wanted to know everything. How to ride, how to rope, how to read the weather, how to shoe a horse. Caleb taught him all of it with the patient, steady attention of a man who had waited his whole life to teach someone something. Bess talked to everyone and everything. The chickens, the cattle, the fence posts, her doll, and the sound of her voice filled the empty spaces in the cabin, the way light fills a room when you finally open the curtains. And Willie. Willie still raised his arms every time Caleb walked through the door. Every single time. And Caleb picked him up every single time. And every single time it meant the same thing it had meant that first morning by the wagon. That some doors don't need to be unlocked. They just need someone small enough to walk through them. 4 years later, the ranch was a different world. The herd had doubled. Joe had planted an orchard along the creek, apples and pears that were just starting to bear. Nettie was 16 and keeping the ranch books with a precision that made the bank clerk in town nervous. Thomas could run the cattle operation on his own for a week if he had to. Bess had stopped talking to her doll because she had too many real people to talk to. And Willie was 8, and he no longer said Caleb's name. He said Dad. He said it the way you say a word that has always been yours, that never belonged to anyone else. that fits so perfectly in your mouth you can't imagine a time when you didn't know it. One evening, Joe found Caleb standing on the porch, watching the children in the yard. Thomas was teaching Willie to rope a fence post. Bess was singing to the chickens. Nettie was sitting on the step reading a book with the last of the daylight. Joe stood next to him and leaned her shoulder into his arm. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking about what the doctor told me when I was 19. He said I'd never have children." He was wrong. Caleb looked at her. He was right about what he meant. And he was wrong about what it means. She nodded toward the yard. "That's 4 children, Caleb. Yours. Not because you made them, because you chose them. Every day. Every morning you get up and choose them again. That's more than blood. Blood is an accident. Choosing is a decision. And you've made it every single day for 4 years." He put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch and watched the light fade, and the children come inside one by one, each of them passing through the doorway, bringing noise and warmth, and the kind of chaos that he'd spent 12 years calling absence without knowing its real name. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that what makes a father isn't what the body can give, but what the heart chooses, then you belong right here. Subscribe for more stories of quiet men who became everything, of women who saw what the world missed, and of families built not from blood, but from stubborn, daily, unshakable love. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next one.